Hi, folks. Thanks for joining. This is Merritt Baer. I'm a principal in the office of the CISO here at AWS, and I am going to be talking to you today on the topic of security as women's work, which I kind of deliberately did in a sassy framing here. So let me see if I can share my screen. Let's see. Go. All right. So this is my contact information. I work for AWS, and there I do a mix of trying to make our internal security better and ensuring that our customers have good guidance around their security. So when a customer says, my CISO wants to talk to your CISO, a lot of the time they get me. And this has led me to really be able to translate between those worlds, right? To have some of the things that we are able to work on ourselves that I can then externalize to share with customers. So let's dig into why security is women's work. I'm going to start by telling a story. So I read a book that was interesting recently, and the book is called Moonwalking with Einstein, but the author is a guy named Jonathan Safran Foer, and Joshua Foer. His brother is Jonathan Safran Foer, who wrote The Unbearable Lateness of Being. And he started studying for the World Memory Championships. And he did this because he was writing an article, and he ends up winning the US memory championships. And the reason that he was intrigued is that these folks who are doing feats of memory, like memorizing a randomly shuffled deck of cards or the first X numbers of pi or whatever, they are doing these kind of like abstract tasks. And he interviewed them, and they all individually would say, I don't have a uniquely good memory. Like, there is no such thing as a photographic memory. I just have trained myself. And so it was really interesting because what they end up discovering, which is actually based on Simonides of Chios in the 6th century BC, who attended a dinner party where there was a tragic fire and everyone except him died. And folks said, okay, well, tell me who was there. Tell me who was at this dinner party. And he said, I don't know. I can't possibly think of everyone. And then what he found was that if he placed them spatially, like around the table, so this person was sitting here and this person was across from them, this person was next to them, that then he was able to reconstruct it. And from this, we kind of gained this insight that humans are much more spatial than we are linear, right? And so the way that the memory champions work, and this is a link to the New York Times excerpt from this book, if folks are curious to follow up. But what they do is they create what's called memory palaces. So just like that dinner party where he recreated it spatially, what folks do when they're trying to improve their memory is they will, you start with the house you grew up with. And so rather than trying to memorize, ace of spades, jack of hearts, whatever, going through all these different kind of abstract ideas, what they do is they will put them in spaces. So you start with the house you grew up in, and then they start actually reading like Architectural Digest magazine. So this is a house in Australia that just looked cool. That's an example of like you walk in and you turn left, and there under the doormat is something, and then you go into the cabinet, and that's where the Queen of Hearts is. And so when they're trying to recreate it, they'll mentally walk back through that palace. And I think this is interesting as a revelation, and it kind of made sense to me in part because as we abstract away, I work for AWS, which is the cloud, right? So what we're talking about is that computing in its sort of old form, which was kind of linear, like I'm worried about the rogue server under someone's desk, that we're actually now interacting with infrastructure as code and then doing security as code. And so there is a long sort of inheritance here from smart women who actually have had these revelations before. So this is a picture of Ada Lovelace. If we were in person, I would have folks raise their hand. Who is this? But at any rate, she was the only legitimate child of Lord Byron, the poet. And I think that's not a coincidence, right? She had these insights into the future of computing and the ability for computers to, quote unquote, act upon other things besides number. to really do reasoning and higher order thinking and logic rather than just being computers in the sense of like compute and linear functions. And I think this is one of the first revelations that I wanted to have us think about today, is just the ways in which I think as we move away from those kind of traditional considerations around IT, whether it was like your traditional perimeter of like when you walk into the building, now you trust your computer, or whether it is traditional considerations around IT and simply like having the capacity these days, because of cloud being the disruptor that it is in this space, we no longer have to deal with those kinds of manual processes in the same way. And so rather than worrying about the rogue server under someone's desk, what you're really doing is reasoning about the permissions. You're doing software level, those higher layers of the stack. We'll talk about this a little more. But what that really means in a sense is that we get to do higher order reasoning. We get to think about these and reason about them and have, infrastructure as code then allows you to do security as code, that allows you to do embed code as logical formulas. So to literally encode your security. Again, this goes really far back. And actually, initially, computers were women's work. So of course, this is not any positive thing in a sense, because it was thought to be really menial and kind of like, just logistical when you were moving switchboards around. But it is also interesting that here we are, right, where computing in large part is dominated by men. And yet we have this really important early legacy that women have been involved in computers, both from the sort of tactical level like this, where a lot of the early women of NASA and other, frontiering kind of elements of what we think of in the infrastructure. And then at the same time, a lot of the major thinkers were ones that were allowing us to move beyond some of those existing artifacts in the landscape. So sometimes when I'm in conversations with security folks, what I notice is that, security folks are often very risk averse by nature, and that is what led them into the security field in the first place. But they tend to then, I think, overestimate the risk of moving and underestimate the cost of staying where you are. And so I sometimes use this Paul Coelho quote to kind of demonstrate that, right? To say that what you're doing today, like not moving, not growing up, not maturing your shop, has a risk, and you're literally and metaphorically paying for that. And so embracing the idea that blossoming comes with, sure, some risks, but also some deprecation of other risks that you're currently embracing, right? That you're currently accepting and living with. I also like to kick off my conversations by kind of reorienting us from how do I lock this down to how do I free us up? So I often start about, thinking about how you can free your business to do more and how security can be part of your bottom line proposition. So again, coming back to that higher order reasoning and the ability to do kind of higher level thinking, what we're really allowing us to do is to not only in the security context, like create data lakes and reason on top of them, but also to know our security really authoritatively, to have it be part of the business value proposition that your enterprise is striving toward, whether you are working for the US government on a mission, or whether you are, a pharma company or a hospitality or whatever. Your bottom line includes the security that you're delivering as part of that. And so I think thinking through how security is a business enabler, how we are sort of being forced these days, again, this growing up with cloud, this kind of basic premise that now with the use of templatizing and the ability, when I say infrastructure as code, I'm referring to things like a CloudFormation template, right? Where it's written in JSON, you can spin up infrastructure from your side, you're interacting on the console or in an API and you're writing commands, and those are literally spinning up physical resources on our side, right? But from your perspective, you can have this kind of immutability and ephemerality where you come back to a CloudFormation template that has your known good state or that has your resources that you're spinning up and spinning down. I even have some customers that choose to spin down every evening or however regularly so that they know they're coming back to a known good state. Oh, I just went ahead a little. So of course, when I refer to the fact that like your cloud provider is taking that heavy lifting and shifting off of your plate, it doesn't mean it goes away. We do it, right? And one of the things that I kind of like to highlight in talks is just that there is a lot of thought and a lot of work that goes into the resiliency that we plan for. And of course, on your side as a customer, you can also architect for high availability. And as you know, the CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, availability, which is kind of commonly accepted to be the security triad. I think availability gets too little credence. So I really think it's crucial. Like I was saying, being a business enabler, part of what you're looking to do is make sure that things work. But part of the definition of does this work needs to have an InfoSec lens on it, right? So thinking through how we contribute to your resilience, you, the customer, is really interesting to me. And I've done some research here around how we do this internally. But we have huge teams that do a ton of research around region design. As you know, we're global. So these are, photos that are somewhat recent, but I'm sure could be updated tomorrow with more regions, more points of presence. But we're really talking about the way that we build in. And if folks are especially interested in this, Peter DeSantis, one of our VPs, does a lot of really interesting talks. You can get lost on YouTube. But we're talking about data centers really building in, again, like, this feels so heavy, and it is, but we take care of it, right? And we're talking about everything from the concrete floor up through layer 4, the hypervisor. So we're talking about the HVAC, the guards and the gates, and of course, the racking and stacking of servers. We do all of our own custom hardware. So for us, this is called the Nitro system. We do our own silicon, we do our own hypervisor, we do our own cards and chips. And that has inherent security benefits. So one, as we know, supply chain is a huge area of concern these days, or at least attention. And so knowing that we build our own custom hardware is really critical here from a security sort of chain of custody perspective. But also we build a lot of our products, including this hardware, with inherent security functionalities. So when we think about the ways that you inherit security just by virtue of being on AWS, these are some of the things that we have baked in. So for example, you can do live updates with no downtime when we're talking about Nitro infrastructure. We can, with our KMS, right, our key management system, for example, there just is no toggle that says, hand me the plain text keys. And we do this on purpose. We make security a first-class citizen. And we do that by the way that we build our engineering products themselves. And we, of course, these are technology, so they're human built. But we make sure that security comes in through the same front door. I don't think that there is such thing as a secure backdoor, right? Things are either secured or they are not. And so having that fundamental belief means that we never compromise our security standards, but we do have an inherent belief in things like encryption. So every API call goes over the open internet with no inherent trust, but it's protected by SigV4, right? Some of these new realities in cloud scale security include infrastructure as code, as I've mentioned. So this is kind of a base from which we start. Automation, the fact that everything is API driven. In 2002, Jeff Bezos issued what we call the API mandate, that everything would be an API, and that allows us to scale. It allows things to work really seamlessly and to be automated at scale. And that, of course, has inherent security benefits and, of course, innovation as well. But I don't think that we should be speaking individually about the way that you're developing and innovating and the way that you're securing it. Those must be in concert, and they are married. They're aware of and augmenting one another. Runtime security, so things like rip and replace architectures, right? So, your web server gets popped, you kill it and spin up a new one. Well, you haven't solved your problem. But at the same time, the ability to do continuous validation of what you think allows you to have a higher order of awareness or of confidence in the security that you are doing. And then finally, coming back to that immutability, that validation and enforcement. So that ephemerality and immutability, I think, is a real hallmark of the way that we think about security in cloud. And what that means in practice is also that we are able to get back to a known good state, but we're also able to just kind of treat our architectures as cattle, not pets, right? So allow yourselves to iterate upon the templates that you have to get back to a known golden AMI, for example. Those kinds of things are just like really radical in light of what our problems were 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. These are some just to keep in mind when I think about Our principal engineer tenets, these are they. And the respect what came before, I think is especially relevant if we're talking about security being women's work, right? There's a lot of legacy here that we should think about, that we should be learning from, and that we, without being stuck in the mud, I think we often don't recognize the long history that women have had in contributing to this field, and in particular to allowing it to grow up and to really transcend beyond those kind of chronological, linear ways of thinking. As we know, people who think differently code differently, and people who code differently solve problems differently. And when we are really talking about security teams growing up, what we're talking about is having them allow more of the stuff that life is made of in the room. And really that requires us to embrace that in how we hire. Automated reasoning is one of those examples of the ways that we do this higher order reasoning. So again, if we were in person, I'd say, who's this on the side of the screen? And you would all raise your hand and we would have a back and forth. But this is Euclid, because the concept here goes at least as far back as Euclidean mathematics. So rather than go out and try to count every prime number, we accept the infinitude of primes to be true. And that is an example of the kind of scoping down that you can do to solve a math problem and to know it authoritatively. So on the other side of the screen here is it looks like an IAM policy. So again, this is written in JSON. It's allowing you to get a resource from an S3 bucket. And what we're really talking about here is this ability that computers have to parse these permissions. So as you know, with these fine-grained identity-centric permissions, you're going to have roles and users, and you're going to have resources and assets that have controls on them. Computers can do really strong reasoning around that. And in my view, whatever a computer is good at, a computer should do. But of course, there will always be room for higher order reasoning for computers to take the instructions that humans give them. And so what we're really talking about when we talk about automating is minimizing that gray area of human decision making so that it's reserved for the truly novel or high stakes. And this is kind of a premise of how we approach security, that we should know what we can, reason about what we know to be true, allow ourselves to continuously validate that using the math, knowing, for example, we know when our crypto is correct because the math resolves, right? So, but you want to reserve that for really high stakes or things in which a high degree of certainty is critical. So things like whether your boot code is correct, or in identity and access management, which permissions are more permissive in an identity and access management policy, or how to escalate those permissions. Or in another example, we have a tool that's in Inspector now that can tell you authoritatively, without sending a single packet over the network, what your network reachability is and whether you have, for example, an internet-facing endpoint. So that tells you both from a security and a compliance perspective, because of course, internet-facing endpoints are part of a PCI recommendation or requirement. So there are elements of this that allow you to do security and compliance differently. These are the examples, some of the examples I mentioned. So the ones in orange are our internal uses, and the ones in blue are external ones that are now part of services. We use this in a range of ways. And I think it's not so much to say that everything revolves around automated reasoning, obviously not. It's just an indication of what this kind of reconciling looks like when you're doing higher order math. This is a bunch of math PhDs, basically, doing reasoning, because once you have that infrastructure as code, it looks like math problems, and it's pretty fascinating. So by that same token, when we hear terms like zero trust, right, the idea is not that you lock it down like, okay, this notebook is zero trust, nothing comes in or out. The idea is rather, at least in our view, that you reduce possibly down to zero the relevance of an actor's position within the network. So that actor could be a human, like you and I, who have permissions to access things, or it could be a piece of software doing machine-to-machine communication. But the idea is that you don't make a binary choice between those, perimeter kind of traditional considerations and things that allow you to filter out that signal to noise, and those fine-grained identity-centric controls. So thinking through how we couple those together, have them not only working together, but ideally aware of and augmenting one another. So an example of this would be a VPC endpoint policy, where you have both a perimeter and those fine-grained identity-centric controls built in. These are some of the North Stars that I look to, and this is my list, not an Amazonian dicta, but the idea is that you will have some North Stars, and how you get there over time will look different. But as the technologies change, but the goals here stay fairly constant, and that you kind of gear your boat in that direction. So minimizing human access, the belief that like good intentions are not enough, and ensuring that you have lowercase p kind of human level policies to go with your technologies. Automating as much as you can, encrypting all the things end to end. So data at rest would be AES 256, and in transit, this will be SSL TLS. Building mechanisms and tooling to ensure that you can scale and also are not relying on good intentions. As Eric Brandwein, our VP, says, let's see, if it's not someone's job, it's a hope, and a hope is not a plan. And then finally, pushing, not pulling. I'm referring to code repositories. So out of considerations around security and IP, ensuring that you're keeping your open source separate from your proprietary. All of those considerations lead me to have added this one somewhat recently, which is to say, especially if you're code developing, don't be pulling from shared repositories, always push. This is referring to that API mandate I mentioned earlier. It really requires that everyone come through the same front door. And that's a certain statement about the role of security in your organization. It's basically a commitment that we will not make workarounds and expect that security can just be, something we tack on after the fact. Security is just part of how we actually operate. And we have kind of required that the entire organization grow up as the security of our enterprise does. This was Steve Schmidt's top 10 list when he delivered a talk recently-ish around how to prioritize some of your considerations for working on AWS. Of course, as we take care of those lower layers of the stack, it is still the shared responsibility model where the customer will be the ones who know what they're doing on those higher layers. So between layer 4 and 7, those software layers of the stack. And these are things that we encourage you to, internalize, take back, ensure you're using to ensure that you're doing login monitoring, using MFA, using short-term ephemeral credentials, for example, not hard coding them. These are just like eat your vegetables things to keep in mind. And then finally, I often get the question, how do we build a culture of innovation? And I would say, you do it, right? Culture is what you repeatedly do. So it's not so much that you can tack on a culture after the fact. What you're really talking about is how do your behaviors create the kind of culture that you're trying to foster? And part of that will revolve around how you hire and how you create that diversity and kind of freedom of thought. But a lot of it will also require you to think about how you're creating mechanisms that inspire good behavior. And by good, I mean making the secure thing to do the easiest thing to do, which is actually hard. As I mentioned, hiring is a huge aspect. I have this photo in here to tell a story, and I know I'm at time, so this will be the end. But one, if you're interested in Amazon jobs, feel free to reach out to me or to other folks like Val Miller who are helping to organize today. We're always happy to take a look at your resume and talk to you about opportunities at Amazon. This one is inspired in particular by a story of my little brother. We grew up in Colorado, and he's Ogallala Lakota. He's born on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And he went off to preschool. It's Colorado, and they told them to draw the mountains. So all the kids came back with their little triangles, and Lyle had circles. And, he had gotten a 0 on it. And we said, did you not understand it? And he explained that he had drawn them from the sky. And so it was like one of those moments that I realized he was seeing the world differently. And I think when we talk about diversity of thought and problem solving, what we really mean is finding ways to embrace problems differently, to solve better, and knowing that technology is a human-made landscape. I almost said man-made, which is sort of in some ways too true, but that we have this kind of call to action to get involved, to share the stuff that our life is made of, which will inform how we build and how we secure those technologies. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to questions if we have time. All right. Question from a participant. Deka Elmi, I was always told that Amazon charges for everything. So if someone buys a cloud storage service, is there inherent security that comes with it, or do they have to buy Nitro Hypervisor? So the infrastructure that I was talking about is inherent to what you are paying for when you run on AWS. So yeah, I mean, sure, you have to pay for everything just like you do in any other aspect of the world, right? We're a company, and what we're selling is storage, compute, and databases on which you can build a lot of things, from a public-facing web page to a machine learning service to, the infrastructure that runs sports telecasts, or it is across a variety of industries. You can do R&D in it for pharma companies. And, we've been instrumental in helping some of the COVID developments, for example. But these are just like the wide range of applications. And by that, I mean just like use cases that we have for cloud technologies, right? When you do spin up anything, so Nitro is underpinning all of EC2. So that's our basic unit of compute. Our basic unit of storage is S3. And then there are a number of databases, some managed, some less managed. But yes, you would, if you spin up some compute in Amazon, you are getting the Nitro hypervisor and card and whatever. That underpins the EC2 offering itself, and that has inherent security properties that I was mentioning. Of course, on your side, you'll want to also architect for security. Another question: what is my preference for those who would like to connect with me? I keep LinkedIn to people who I know in real life, so as to distinguish from the rest of the internet. And I generally I'm available on Twitter at Merritt Baer. Or if you have a specific question or want a referral for jobs or a conversation around that, feel free to use email. But if you would like to kind of just follow me and my cute baby pictures and my thoughts on security or talks I'm giving, Twitter is the best way. All right. Well, thank you so much, folks. And feel free to follow up. As I mentioned, here's my contact. And thanks to Day of Security for ensuring that we have this platform to have this conversation, and look forward to the rest of today. And thanks again for being involved and for all of your interest.